Which engine do you want?
Number 3.
Ready to go?
Stand up.
You are ready for engine start.
Clear on 3. Starting 3.
You know, there are so few left in the world, and it was such an iconic aircraft in the first place.
We've got one of the best Lancasters for completely stock World War II, and you can tour it.
The Lancaster was incredible, being able to carry such a varied payload.
We want to show it to them, but we want them to see it, smell it, and hear it.
The aspiration was to have this aircraft flyable. As it turned out, it was impossible.
Most of the bomber crews that flew out of England against Germany in World War II were trained in Canada.
It's absolutely incredible to think what they accomplished in a very short time at a very young age.
I would say within 2 weeks at squadron level, they knew how many crews were not coming back every night.
1 out of every 4 Canadians killed in that war was killed in Bomber Command.
When you're in a street fight, are you going to be a gentleman? Or if you know that guy is going to kill you, are you going to put him down first? Do you know about a street fight?
And you know that they have something between them that you can never impinge on. You can never get behind and understand in its entirety.
When you are trying to break down a giant concrete wall and all you have is a sledgehammer, you try to hit the factories, but you also will be hitting the cities.
It's not a question that ever left them. They lived with it all their lives.
Oh, I think some of these bomber boys went to their graves thinking they were war criminals.
History is relentless. It does not stop. It accrues hour by hour, day by day, providing little opportunity to sort and catalog the thousands of daily inputs that produce the passage of time. Not every moment needs to be remembered. Collectively, we strive to remember those we can agree on as important signposts on the march of human progress. Many of these come from the realms of science and medicine, more still from leaps in technology through the ages. Above all, however, we remember the wars, always the wars, through the centuries, fought to project power or ideals, a need for resources, or along ethnic and religious lines. Or, as was the case with the Second World War, a terrible and true clash of ideologies, fought over the fundamental question of how we should live, of how societies could be and should be ordered, over freedom, over tyranny. It is the last major war closest to us, and with the weight of history accruing daily, it takes an active will to remember what it meant, to honor those who fought in it, to ensure that hard lessons are not forgotten. And so we gather yearly at cenotaphs, at gravesites, at monuments, to remember. And we do so in increasing numbers, seemingly as the world around us grows ever more divided along lines that we recognize as dangerous faults. We have built museums dedicated to remembrance, to house the stories and the relics of that war. And sometimes we have opportunity to see and touch and hear the weapons of that war, to help us make it real and understand it not as the accrued dust of history, but as a tangible piece to be held and understood. This is a story of a legendary airplane from that war, the Avro Lancaster, the 4-engined backbone of the RAF's Bomber Command. It explores the role of the Lancaster, both in the Allied victory and its more subdued role after the war, during the peace. But warbirds are fundamentally metal and munitions. This too is a story of the men who flew them, who brought these weapons to bear over Europe, and died in staggering numbers, whose efforts and whose sacrifices were placed to one side after the war, ignored in shadows made longer by the elephant in the room. It is a story of Bomber Command and the long and terrible war waged over the roof of Fortress Europe, dangerous and dark. It is a story of Arthur Harris and his highly controversial command, of Winston Churchill and his air ministry, of the United States Army Air Force. And it is a story about how we remember it.
Yes, she was nearly ready for battle. And as we looked at that long, slender plane...
At Malton, Ontario, Canada, on the site of what is now Pearson International Airport, Victory Aircraft built 430 Lancaster bombers, only one of Canada's contributions to the war effort. From the arrival of blueprints, through the hiring and training of a workforce, to the rollout of the very first Lancaster, was a remarkable 16 months.
We took our big plane out of her hangar slowly onto the gray concrete runway.
KB-700 was the first of an initial order of 300 Lancasters, and of a subsequent order for 200 aircraft. 130 were built, designated the FM series. The Lancaster was an immediate success, both with operational planners within the Air Ministry and crews alike.
The Lancaster inspires so much devotion is because we built it here. We had so many people serve in it, but it flew beautifully. The guys could count on it to carry such a heavy load that it exceeded all other British bombers by a considerable margin.
What made the Lancaster famous and a great aircraft probably was its durability and popularity with the crew. Anyone that we've talked to from the wartime that actually flew the Lancaster said it was a very easy aircraft to fly. And of course it could carry the heaviest bomb load, but I think the crews generally thought it was a pretty good aircraft to fly, and they felt as safe as you could be in a bomber at that time. Each base or squadron would probably have about 16 Lancasters.
At a typical airbase on a Lancaster squadron, aircrew and ground crew were a very tightly bound team. They respected each other enormously.
A lot of the aircrew, though, gave credit to the ground crews. You know, the ones that really appreciated them, you know, they gave them a lot of credit. And they said, if it wasn't for those guys, you know, we couldn't have done what we did. And that's the truth. Well, I better carry on here.
You've got a number of things. So there's engine maintenance to do. So oil would have to be added. Each engine has a 30-gallon oil tank. So they would have to top those up. Then they would have to put the fuel load on. And a full fuel load would be about 2,000 gallons. So it would take a bit of time. There's 3 fuel tanks in each wing. You then have the bombers, the guys that will load up all the armaments. So there's a certain order that the bombs are loaded because the center of gravity has to be maintained. So there's a specific order in which those bombs are loaded. And the armorers then too would have to load the ammunition for all the guns. So even just the rear gun, there's 2,000 rounds in each ammo box on each side of the aircraft, and then another 650 rounds in the track that goes to the rear turret. And that's just the rear turret. So.
Among the crew of 7, the relationship between the pilot and the flight engineer was critically important.
Because the pilot was busy pushing on the rudder because the rotation and torque of the engines would steer the Lanc right off the runway. And the propeller's 13 feet diameter, so it pulls. So he had to keep his foot full right rudder to keep it straight. So he was busy. And then the engineer did the throttles. Once they're off the ground, the engineer would then assume his seat behind the pilot, so he'd be looking after engine temperatures and monitoring all those things. Actually, he's watching all that stuff because the pilot has no idea. The pilot's just flying the aircraft, and he's mainly listening to the navigator for directions. His whole job is going to be keeping on that bearing until all the airplanes formed up. So you can imagine 16 aircraft have taken off. You're going to be circling above the runway until everyone's up. Sometimes there were 1,000 aircraft, so you had to be in the right point in the bomber stream when you were going. So there was the pilot was a busy guy until they got going. And then again, his main person is going to be the navigator as far as directions.
The Lancasters were very modifiable. They were a modular design, and they could be adapted to carry pretty much any payload.
Adaptability was a byword of the Lancaster. Although famous for its use over the roof of Fortress Europe, the Lancaster was instrumental in bringing the war to the Atlantic as well. It was famously used in the sinking of the German battleship Tirpitz, caught in a Norwegian fjord before she could escape to the open seas to menace Allied shipping.
12,000-pound earthquake bombs are released directly over the skulking giant. Direct hits are registered.
And eventually it was the tall boy bombs that finally created the shock that punctured the hull and crippled the Tirpitz. It was also adapted for carrying the enormous, the 22,000-pound Grand Slam, as they called it, earthquake bomb. It was so big, in fact, that bomb, they had to adapt the bomb bay. They had to remove the bomb bay doors and hang the bomb was half in and half out of the bomb bay when they mounted it inside the Lancaster. Its principal targets were items like viaducts, bridges, railway tunnels, and other strategic sites of importance to the Germans.
Line of supply is a tribute to yet another all-British achievement.
Also the hardened submarine pens at Lorient in northern France. And the way they operated, the way they worked, is they could penetrate about 33, 34 feet of solid concrete, or if there was no concrete there, about 120 feet depth in soil. And they could set the delay for explosion. They didn't explode instantly when they hit the ground. They could set the delay from a few milliseconds to minutes, even hours. After the bomb hit the ground, say it was going through hardened concrete, it would explode underground and it would create an earthquake. And it would also create a large crater. So you didn't have to be totally accurate on a target. If you created an enormous earthquake of a few hundred feet diameter, everything would cave in and fall into it. And the Lancaster was the only aircraft that could deliver that size of bomb.
Its most famous mission was flown against hydro dams in the Ruhr Valley, memorialized as the Dam Busters Raid. Led by Guy Gibson, flying Lancasters modified to carry the highly specialized upkeep bomb. The operation to blow open the Möhne, Eder, and Sorpe dams to flood industry and towns in the Ruhr Valley was a qualified success. Of the 19 Lancasters of 617 Squadron to set out, 8 did not return, with 53 men killed.
Bomber Command are out in great force. They continue to seek out and blast the highly camouflaged launching bases in France.
Lancasters also paid regular visits to V1 and V2 launch sites, which continued to fire these terror weapons against London, right up until the sites were overrun following the Allied breakout from Normandy in 1944.
It is now revealed these incessant Allied bombings delayed the flying bomb menace by many months.
Allied troops drive into the Pas-de-Calais area. One by one, the launching sites are overrun. As Canadian and Allied troops drive the Germans from each one, the bombardment of London diminishes in proportion. All that is left of the launching bases is just a mass of wreckage.
The Lancaster proved to be a remarkably adaptable and devastatingly effective strategic weapon in the war against Germany. It also stood as a clear reminder of what might have been for the enemy had history not been quite so fickle. In what was truly an accident of history, in 1936, German General Walter Weaver was killed when his Heinkel HE-70 crashed, the result of a negligent pre-flight check, which failed to notice that gust locks had not been removed from control surfaces. Weaver at that time was the Luftwaffe's Chief of Staff and the strongest proponent for the development of a strategic heavy bomber force, capable of striking distant targets with payload similar to a Lancaster or Halifax. Upon his death, the program to develop this Ural bomber was fatally sidelined in favor of the lighter and faster twin-engine bombers, a far more tactical force. The German strategic four-engine bomber effectively died with him, and although they eventually produced the massive Heinkel HE-177 Griffin, it was nicknamed the Flying Coffin, partly due to the complexities of its design resulting in engine fires, four engines being coupled in pairs. In a final historic irony, by the time the Griffin was an effective weapon late in the war, there was no fuel to fly it. The Allied strategic bomber force attacks on oil targets had starved it of fuel. Lancasters flew well over 150,000 operations during the war, dropping over 600,000 tons of bombs. Roughly half of them were destroyed. They were, without question, a decisive factor in the Allied victory. The Lancaster took the victory lap with plenty of fuel left in the tank. When the war ended, what remained of the Canadian-built Lancasters were returned to Canada, the question of what to do with them uncertain. While some remained in service with the RCAF directly after the war, many others were eventually placed into storage in Alberta due to its drier western climate and the fact that there were already air bases and facilities in the province to accommodate and store them. In the very small town of Nanton, south of Calgary, one of these Lancasters, designation FM 159, eventually came to rest.
The Bomber Command Museum started in this small town with a Lancaster, and then over a space of 30-some years, they built an entire museum of many aircraft with expertise to restore and rebuild, and all of that was done around one old Lancaster bought for $513 in 1961. And three of our town's fathers organized a crew and towed the Lancaster cross-country 15 miles to sit beside the number 2 highway, and everything that you might see here today is built around the Lancaster as a national memorial.
The museum is dedicated to the memory of the 10,855 Canadians who were killed serving in Bomber Command. It is committed wholeheartedly to the preservation of their memory, and Carl Kasgard, one of several museum directors, is a passionate advocate and educator, engaging visitors, reminding them of the sacrifices made by those whose names are etched on the memorial wall outside, using words which could well be the museum's mantra.
Freedom is not free. Somebody paid for you.
One of those who paid the price is Ian Bazalgette, to whom FM 159 is dedicated. He was awarded the Victoria Cross for his courageous actions as the pilot of a Lancaster over France, a pathfinder marking the target of a V-1 launch site.
He had already gone to the location that they had to bomb and marked it. At that point, he had one engine out already. On the way back, more damage was inflicted. Finally, he was down to one engine. He told the crew to bail out, with the exception of 2 that were badly injured. So his goal then was to try and land to save these 2, because he could have bailed out, but he stuck with the airplane. He actually got it down, but eventually hit a fence or a stone wall or something, and then the aircraft exploded at that point. But he did his best to get it on the ground and to try and save them.
The museum itself is very much an active participant in Remembrance, and among the many displays one would typically expect to find are those which engage the senses in a hands-on kind of way.
We have simulators for the kids to fly, and they could be as old as they want, but they're still kids. You can crawl in the cockpits of a Lancaster, and you can go inside our Lancaster in the back fuselage and look at the turrets and all of the wartime furnishings. We've got one of the best Lancasters for completely stock World War II, and you can tour it. but interactive. We want these people to become totally immersed in it. And we have the tail section of a Lancaster, and it came with a turret that wasn't live. We replaced the hydraulic lines, rewired the entire turret, and now it's an operational turret with firing guns and strobes in the barrels of the guns to make it look real. People just love seeing this is what it was like to be a tail gunner on a Lancaster.
I think one of the aspects that has made this such a driver for the BC Aviation Museum is the unique nature and the ever-diminishing opportunity to restore something like this. You know, there are so few left in the world. The pilots and the aircrew obviously are diminishing on a daily basis, unfortunately and inevitably. So many people have a father, or a mother for that matter, involved in either the production of or the flying of the Lancaster, and certainly even more people had grandparents who were influenced, affected, flew in, were part of during the wars and afterwards. So it still has a very common association for a lot of people, and it was such an iconic aircraft in the first place. This particular Lancaster, which was built in 1944 in Canada, shipped over to the UK. Basically, the war concluded before it was able to see active service. In fact, it never even had armaments put in it.
So it returned to Canada in late 1945 and went into storage for a number of years. And around 1952, it was chosen, because it had such low time on it, it was chosen to be converted to a maritime patrol search and rescue aircraft. And it flew in that role up until about 1964.
Many of the Lancasters went to Alberta and for disposal as scrap. They had about 80 that they kept, this being one of them. They stored them for a few years, and then over the following, in the late 40s into the early 50s, they reconfigured them. There was a basic conversion that they did, and that was doing things like adding de-icing and anti-icing for propellers. All the leading edges got de-icing. That's all post-war. It was put in. They improved things like the cockpit heating and things like that.
So this aircraft served as a maritime patrol aircraft. It then served as a search and rescue aircraft, and then it served again as a maritime patrol aircraft. Now, the reason why we use Lancasters in these roles is because, number one, we had produced them and we owned them. And when the need for maritime patrol and search and rescue came up, they said, well, let's use these airplanes. So there's no need to camouflage them. We took off the turrets, the front turret, the top turret, and the rear turret. They were not required. You were not going to get attacked by Messerschmitts over the Pacific Ocean. And our particular aircraft, FM-104, actually flew out of Comox for a number of years. That's one of the reasons why we wanted it as well. This was a British Columbia aircraft for many years.
It was, in '64, retired officially, along with all the other Lancasters. And several of them ended up as memorials in different cities, provinces. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia got one each. And then Toronto got one, which is this one. In '65, they put it up on a 30-foot concrete plinth. Then it was there for about 35 years. It was painted again in camouflage colors, whereas it flew in a polished metal configuration in the 60s, 50s and 60s. Basically left it for the 35 years, very little maintenance done, and birds would live in it, people lived in it at one point, and a lot of weather and corrosion damage.
And when the City of Toronto said, well, we need that space back, we need the Lancaster to come off the pedestal, it went to the Toronto Aviation Museum.
They had it for about 10 years. They took it apart and took it indoors, disassembled it, and started doing some work on it, stripping the paint on some sections. In the end, they lost their facility due to land development, and so then the City of Toronto stored FM-104 in various pieces. Then in 2018, after several years of this, after the museum closed in Toronto, the city decided they didn't want to spend money storing it anymore and looked for a way to deaccession it from their collection.
Space was a big issue. Money, human resources, they didn't have it to make it work, to restore the aircraft to a static position where it could be sitting on the ground for the public to see.
There are only 2 Lancasters on the planet which are capable of flight. The best known is PA-474, which flies with the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight in England. The other is the Andrew Monarski Lancaster, KB-726, at the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum in Hamilton, Ontario. They are very rare airplanes, only 2 of the 7,377 Lancasters which were built. In Lincolnshire, in England, restoration to flight status for NX-611 continues. Just Jane is one of only 2 which are limited to taxiing, and she does so regularly with paying customers on board, throttles forward, getting up to speed across a grass field before being reined in for the time being until the day she is able to take to the skies.
To pay for the restoration, they take people on taxi rides, and for 20 minutes you get to sit inside a Lancaster. They take it up to a fast taxi, and it is a fantastic experience. Really gave me an insight into what it would be like to be a crew member on board a Lancaster heading off at dusk to a mission over Germany.
FM-159 is the other which can only taxi. While the apron outside the museum is too restricted to practically allow this, as the centerpiece and star of the museum, FM-159 takes the stage to perform on a regular basis.
Running of the Merlin engines, we do this on a fairly regular basis, about once a month through the normal summer season. It's good for the engines. It keeps them properly lubricated and in good running condition.
It is a very large airplane, and with a wingspan of 102 feet, there is very little room for error to assist her passage from the hangar to the stage. But like any good performer, she hits her mark, and preparations are made for the performance to come.
We have our Lancaster crew who basically run the aircraft when it's on our special days where we do running, and the maintenance on them as well.
Yellow breakers on, starboard fuel valve, number 2.
3 throttle set. Are we clear on the ground? Starting 3.
We had enough talent of mechanics and aircraft engineers and heavy-duty mechanics. They said we can rebuild these Merlins on our Lancaster to run. And that was the big step forward for this Lancaster here in Nanton, Alberta, is it took us 10 years and we got all 4 Merlins to run.
Yeah, the day the Lancaster arrived, it came in on 5 trucks, including 2 container on the backs of trucks. And at that point, it was in pretty rough shape, I guess, but it was exciting. I mean, and you knew you were part of a restoration in whatever capacity. I'm certain it was too early to suggest just how much work was in it. I mean, the projections were 10 to 20 years to make it airworthy. Well, that's not the case. It's in a lot rougher shape than that.
Mostly, we have a complete airframe. It's one of 17 complete airframes in the world, but we're missing a lot of the detail control parts. Some things were stripped early on before it went on the concrete plinth, while it was on the plinth, and then some parts disappeared while it was, in the Toronto Museum.
From the outset, the plan, at least the aspiration, was to have this aircraft flyable. As it turned out, it was impossible. Many parts were missing, and the cost involved is enormous. It would have been over $10 million.
They were still going to make it fly, but I started to work on things that I could just work on. I went through all the schematics and I looked at some of the wooden cable trays and various parts that I know I could make. But at that time, they were still doing some parts, rebuilding some pieces to be airworthy. Over a period of about a year and a half, it gradually, began to sink in that there's just such an uphill battle and so much money. When the center section floor was cut out, they basically melted that out with just a lot of heat, I presume from oxyacetylene. So heat damage when it went onto the plinth, 35 years on the plinth's corrosion added on top of that. So as soon as they started cutting, it wasn't going to fly without replacing anything that got heated, because now you don't know what the temper is of the aluminum.
The reason that the board decided that the Lancaster would be restored to static display really is financial, plain and simple. And also there's an element of the logistics. We are a museum. We're not an active flying base. There are issues with things like insurance, certification, taxiways. There are an awful lot of elements that would be involved in it being a flying exhibit. The main reason, however, being that it was guesstimated somewhere between $10 and $20 million to restore it to flying condition. We are able to bring it to display condition for a fraction of that amount and a lot faster, a lot quicker, so it can be enjoyed and appreciated by visitors to the museum.
We do not have enough parts, and our Lancaster's not in good enough shape to ever fly, but we want to make a good display, and with time we'll assemble the Lancaster completely, and I hope we'll put 2 or 3 engines on it so people will see what it looks like.
There has been a lot of debate as to how the Lancaster should be presented and the livery that it would be displayed under. The lion's share, if not almost exclusively, the career of this Lancaster was in peacetime. It never carried guns. It never dropped a bomb. It could be representative of a Second World War Lancaster, but that wouldn't really reflect its use in BC.
There isn't one that is in that livery in Canada. They're all sort of wartime camouflage colors, but this is the post-war aluminum-colored aircraft.
For excitement and boyzone and sort of one's interest in perhaps militaria or the war, and I would love to see it bristling with machine guns and painted in camouflage and all the rest of it, but it wouldn't be representative of the incredible story and journey that this aeroplane went through. So it's the right thing to do.
You get some people who are very knowledgeable. You actually get quite a lot of people whose families have been involved. Their father or their grandfather was a pilot, a navigator, a wireless operator, a gunner. And that's fascinating because we as tour guides, we learn from them as well. We get stories, so it's a two-way. We're not just giving information to our visitors. We're getting in many cases, a lot of information back from them, which is fabulous. It was really interesting. A few weeks ago, we had a gentleman come into the museum on a Sunday, very interested to see FM 104, our Lancaster. And it turned out that he was one of the actual pilots of this very Lancaster that we're restoring, and he signed the guest book here. And what a thrill to actually see that and to have a real connection to the aircraft. Fabulous.
While the restoration of FM 104 in Victoria, British Columbia continues,
Clear prop.
in Nanton, Alberta, Efforts have been underway for some years to bring together the two heavy bombers used so effectively by the RCAF. Not resting on their laurels, the museum is planning expansion and raising funds to permit a Lancaster and a Halifax, the twin heavies, to taxi together.
We have this beautiful Lancaster here at Nanton, and now we have the opportunity, the material, the parts to make a Halifax. And for the years 1942, 43, and most of 44, the Canadians flew the Halifax in most of their bomber raids, and we formed a special ops group that's going around the world to collect Halifax parts, and it's called Halifax 57 Rescue. And we've got over half a Halifax now. We decided that we must build another hangar as large as the existing museum. So we have embarked on this journey of a massive expansion here at the Bomber Command Museum of Canada to have a new hangar. And the theme of that expansion is called Home for the Heavies.
There are many challenges in the restoration of any aircraft, and in particular, 80-year-old legends. One is finding parts. The other is paying for them.
I would say the most important part is the scroungers and the guys that are bird dogs. And you put a piece of Halifax under their nose, they get the scent, and you send them out. If you don't have a bird dog, you're short of resources. But we must go to England, we must go to Holland, we must go to France, we must go wherever we must go to find the parts. Find out what someone wants to trade, find out what the price is, and you hope that you have the budget to match the price of the parts.
And I think most of it is in the UK, that activity of scrounging for parts. But keep in mind, we're decades into that. 4 or 5 decades into people looking for these pieces. And very little yet to be found.
Alberta is a dry climate. After the war, thousands of airplanes were stored here. Then farmers bought them for $50 a piece. And we went and got them from the farmers all over Alberta. That's how come we have so many parts.
You really are in competition then with the collectors, who are scroungers. Their motivations are a little different. They just want, let's say, a complete instrument panel in their living room. You're competing with them price-wise for a limited availability of components. So I figure, we are maybe a little bit more deserving because we have an actual aircraft that we can put these components into.
Now, what I do is I have 3 different methods of get it for free, a donation, get it wholesale, lowest price you can get, or if you have to, like pulling teeth, pay retail. But bottom line is you want to get it here. Now, it does help if you know how to play an emotional violin. And I tend to be reasonable at that. And because of this cause of freedom is not free, somebody paid for you, people are sympathetic to that. And you're there representing a group that wants to give tribute, and you would like to get those parts. I'm not bullshitting anybody. I'm just saying, look, it's for the bomber boys. Remember? The Brits and the Canadians and the Aussies and the New Zealanders fighting, and now you and I are free, and you got this part. It's time now that it goes into something good. And you can get good results, such as Carl finds 54 feet of Halifax bomber wing in England, and we got them for donation.
And they do have sales, I know, in the UK, swap meets and things at the, let's call it the consumer or collector level, not necessarily at, the Lancaster group, but just, those boost gauges and some of those instruments and switches were used in multiple different aircraft, right? A 5C 543 single pole switch, you know, there's probably 30 of them in a Lancaster. Spitfire's got about a dozen. Every, you know, aircraft built around that time would have the same switch and multiples of them. It'll be 45 pounds for the switch and 30 pounds shipping for that one switch. The boost gauges, I had been collecting instruments, and I had one at a time found 3 boost gauges that matched and were period correct. And all 3 of those were in the UK. And I found a 4th, matched and everything. He, through eBay International Shipping, he had a few shipments to customers. Somebody in Italy was getting some other parts, you know, et cetera, et cetera. eBay mixed up the tags. The guy in Italy got my boost gauge. I got 3 brake hoses for something that were due to him. And so the vendor had correctly labeled everything, but just in a mix-up. So he got full refund, I got full refund, but even paying for the shipping, the guy in Italy refused to return it. And I sent him all the email chain. It was like, well, why do you want to keep it? Because I have it. You know, so I guess he thought he could sell it, but, you know, and I watched for a while if I see that one pop up, because you can usually tell if it popped up on eBay and it was for sale from somebody in Italy. But, you know, I'm still looking, and then 6 months later, somebody walked in, and it turned out he had one and it matched, and he was in Canada. I paid him that day and got the part later. So now I have 4 matching boost gauges.
Well, it is difficult to get the funding, but remember, if you can raise $1, if you're careful, you can get $10 of value out of $1 donated.
Most of the money that has been used to fund the restoration has come organically from the growth of the museum itself. So from admissions, from sales, promotions, initiatives that have been taken as fundraisers, but it is entirely self-funding. Government funding has been a challenge. We have not had government funding to date specifically for the Lancaster. We apply regularly for government, provincial particularly, and local peninsular grants. They are modest, but very, very gratefully received. But in terms of government funding for the specific Lancaster project, no, it's entirely self-funded by the museum.
As important as parts and money are, there are more intangible assets necessary to any successful restoration. One is a group of volunteers. The other is time.
And to me, a good volunteer is not somebody that is a brilliant mechanic or a brilliant engine man or woman. It's the people that are enthusiastic, that can be part of a team.
So this is evidence that we actually work?
When they're together, they're joking all the time. They're doing good work, but they're joking, and that all comes as part of a good team.
The volunteers that work here are a really tremendous group of passionate people, and they range from, you know, highly experienced aircraft maintenance, manufacturing backgrounds to police officers, firefighters, doctors, you name it, any kind of a background, but there's a passion for aircraft. They're there, and we get along great. We have a good time together.
He understands why we're fixing these airplanes, and he knows the reason why. And they have a sense of humor, and they can get along with people. I found some of the toughest guys to work with on restoration teams are the gifted ones who don't need people skills. So I prefer to have a grinder, you know, like in hockey we tell the guys that are fighting in the corners and working hard, I prefer the grinders. Who's going to pop the puck out of the corner?
It was daunting, absolutely daunting. And again, I knew nothing about what I was doing, so I was under competent, smart, capable people that knew what they were doing. And it was an exciting time, an exciting start. forward number 2 left. The great big pieces were obvious, but when you got buried down in the containers and we're seeing these tiny little parts, it was beyond your comprehension.
A valuable volunteer would be somebody who has restored something. It could be a wooden boat, it could be a car, it could be an airplane. They then turn into chain, come up, and then come to these relay boxes and turn. They attach to steel rods, and it's pull.
So the timeline for a complete restoration is a movable feast, to be perfectly honest. The team come up against adversities that hadn't been anticipated, and then they get breaks on some things that go a lot faster than had been feared.
But you mustn't be too impatient or too pushy on these super rare aircraft of rebuilding them in a year. It could take years. The Mosquito here, or even the Anson further back behind me, it's taken us years to get to this point. But the whole time that you have their attention and their fascination with these great aircraft from World War II, what can you do? You can tell them the stories of the young airmen that flew these.
We have had huge support from other Lancaster owning museums or institutions. I mean, there are only 17 left in the world, so it's a fairly small community. There's a lot of trading of parts from mutual interest aircraft. We've had a huge amount of cooperation from places like Hamilton, who have a flying Lancaster, all the way through to people who flew in the Lancaster themselves, who are themselves a knowledge base that has been drawn on significantly to give us a much broader picture, which makes the restoration so much easier.
The decision to restore FM 104 to a static display brings with it some relief, as the runway to flight status would be far more costly in both time and money.
The thing about that is when you if you reproduced a part or modify it, it has to be to the original engineering, to the original drawings. You can't just make a change and have it be airworthy unless there's a whole certification. So that's one catch that they get into when they're restoring an old aircraft to be certified for flying. You can't alter the original design without a lot of paperwork. And so now if you're doing a static display, it just has to look correct. If we have a part and it's a real part, we clean it up and attach it. This part here. So that's original. It needs a little bit of repair, but we'll clean it up and we'll attach it. It's on the outer end of the port leading edge. But the idea is that when we attach it, it will look hopefully as if it flew a week or a month ago or something, you know. But to look at it, it has to look correct. In some cases, we have an original, like this. This is the original box. This is JB2. That goes behind the starboard inner engine mounted to the front spar. So that was original. We had that. All the wiring inside was very, very corroded. The terminal strips were rusted away. So I had all the schematics, and I went through and ohmed out pin to pin to see that this box matched. So then I cleaned out all the wiring inside. There's nothing in there now. There's no wiring. And we cleaned up the connectors. And I labeled them as they labeled them, like with rubber stamps. So that is an original one, cleaned up to as closely as possible make it look like the original one as it was built.
We're going through different stages of restoring items that have sometimes been left in a ditch for many, many years or been damaged in different ways and or missing altogether. So we have a lot of fun sometimes detective work trying to find things. There are 4 firewalls, 4 engines, and we are looking for as many parts as we can to restore one firewall, in some cases robbing off other firewalls that are not going to be restored. Firewalls were comprehensively labeled so that all levels of people that were working on the airplanes would know where to put things, and that you didn't put the wrong pipe on the wrong holder, and so on. Now, the fun part of that is that, that some of these labels are missing. Some of these labels are entirely unreadable. Some of them not too bad. So, with an enormous amount of detective work, we have come up, for example, with 39 different unique labels that are on this firewall. And the next thing will be to work on what technology we're going to use to produce those labels that are not able to be restored. This labeling of the firewall is one microscopically small component of an absolutely enormous effort that will take more than a decade. Is in all likelihood likely to be a multi-generational effort to restore this wonderful airplane.
It is impossible to speak of the Lancaster without speaking about the engine that powered not only her, but many of the fighter legends of the war, the Rolls-Royce Merlin.
Well, Rolls-Royce built a lot of aero engines, and their fighter engines or their bomber engines, they all named after birds of prey. So the goshawk, the kestrel, the peregrine, the vulture, and the griffin. But the Merlin, which is actually a small hawk, was their most successful.
When they first developed the Merlin engine and they tested it at the factory, then they said, now we're going to do a destructive test. They started it up and they said, we're going to run it beyond takeoff power until it fails. And so they started up this Merlin, they ran it up to takeoff power, and then they jammed the throttle beyond takeoff power till it was absolutely screaming. And they let it sit. And it ran for 125 hours before it failed. That's 5 days.
When it failed, they let it cool down, they took it apart, and they go, oh, a conrod failed. Make the conrods harder, stronger. And then they did it all again. And that is, they just made their engines very, very robust.
A piston aircraft engine is a very complex piece of machinery. It's got many, many moving parts. And I don't think people realize it until they see one that's partly disassembled, just how complex they are and how much detailed work went into their design and manufacture. The Rolls-Royce design team were able to take the engine from the Battle of Britain days when it developed about 1,000 horsepower. And by the end of the war, in the de Havilland Hornet, they were getting up to 2,200 horsepower. And they did this without changing the bore or the stroke of the engine, just by increasing the supercharger pressure. A key factor was the high-octane gasoline that they were able to get from the U.S., so they could develop this. They used it on a total of about 30 aircraft, on the Spitfire and the Hurricane, Lancaster, and then it was later used on the North American Mustang, and where it helped the Mustang to fly at the altitudes where the war was being fought in Europe. The Germans had fighters that could go up and shoot down the bombers. The North American Mustang was critical in that it could fly and escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and thus they had the protection that they desperately needed at the high altitudes, 25,000 feet or so. That was really cold, really thin air, but with the two-stage, two-speed supercharger, the Merlin was able to get the Mustang up to that altitude and be a competitive fighter machine.
The museum has considered bringing the Merlins back to runnable condition. We have the parts to make one of our 5 functional. We can put the one running Merlin on a ground run stand and take it to various fairgrounds and things like that. What I'm hoping is that it will be mounted on the aircraft and we'll run it actually right on the aircraft.
So with the Merlins, it was a little bit of a mystery. We did get 4 Merlins with it. Any of the photographs I have of them, even when they were taking it off the pylon in Toronto, there were no ancillaries. And there were no tags on these engines. So it was, well, these weren't the engines that it flew with.
We're going to dip the head in the kerosene wash to get the oil off prior to grinding the valve seats.
Can I move the paintbrush out of there? Or?
We have to get all of the oil out of here because when we grind the valve seats, the dust from that would stick in the oil and we wouldn't be able to get rid of it.
So most of the cylinders had a wasp nest in them. Now that plus the exposure to the elements, heavily corroded. Those liners are very thin, much thinner than you would expect. So there's no way to line them. There's no oversize that you can do. So those liners are scrap. You could never run them. You could not bore them out. Maybe you'd get rid of all the heavy corrosion, but now there's no liner left.
Getting ready to just dry assemble cylinder head on here to make sure that we can pass a leak down test before they want to throw a lot of money at this thing. Because we're using a lot of used parts. The rings weren't bad, the liners are a bit tired, but if it can pass the leak down test, then we can carry on and hopefully get this thing running.
But bearings are well worn, but all usable because we won't run it high. There won't be a supercharger running if we do run an engine, right? The supercharger there'll be no boost. And it's only a 6-to-1 compression ratio, that engine, with no supercharger on it. So the theory is, yeah, we can put new rings in, hone those liners, build it all back up. So I know they're going through pressure testing right now, to replacing O-rings here, there, everywhere in the engine.
If there were no leaks, then the pressures would be the same. But because all piston rings leak a little bit, then that pressure will be lower. And so that's the test we did on all of the cylinders to make sure that we had enough compression. We're a little disappointed. It wasn't as much as we'd hoped, but it's enough so that the engine would run. There are still some rather deep pits in the cylinder liner that will cause the engine to burn quite a bit of oil. So I expect there'll be quite a bit of blue smoke when we finally get the engine running. But that's not all bad.
The goal, at least at this point, is to not spend huge amounts of money, which is very easy to do on Merlins, but to get out of all those components one engine that would be a ground running unit on a trailer, and it would have no supercharger, but it will make smoke and noise.
At the start of World War II, the Air Forces realized that they needed to have aircrew trained. I am amazed that Canadians are not aware that most of the bomber crews that flew out of England against Germany in World War II were trained in Canada.
Australia, Canada, Britain, and New Zealand signed this agreement to create the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which turned out to be the most successful air training program in history. The Australians contributed $68 million in 1939, New Zealanders $45 million, the British $54 million, and gave us $160 million in used equipment. And Canada, 11 million Canadians, contributed $1.6 billion.
And we trained 70,000 Canadians, we trained 40,000 Brits, and we trained 20,000 Australians and 10,000 New Zealanders how to fly combat in bombers. And it's one of the greatest contributions in World War II to the Allied victory.
This contribution by Canada was such that American President Franklin Roosevelt declared Canada to be the aerodrome of democracy, a takeoff on the moniker applied to his own nation as the arsenal of democracy. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan also attracted many of his countrymen.
I think for a lot of these kids it was an adventure in part, but certainly there was a very strong moral component. Even exemplified by the fact that some of the young men who were RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force, Aircrew, actually came from the United States. There were Americans who had volunteered to come up across the border because the U.S. was not engaged in the war at the time.
All in all, there are about 2,000 Americans now in training here. Britain's fight is theirs, too.
They started off with the basic training, and that might have been anywhere from Sea Island in Vancouver right through to places in Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. Many of the fields were actually located in the prairies because they were wide open spaces. They could easily build a field, and this is one of the amazing things about the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan is that they managed to build from scratch over the course of 2 years some 90 plus full functioning training airdromes with 3 runways each, all the hangars they needed, thousands of aircraft that were brought in from the States and built in Canada. An extraordinary achievement, just an unbelievable achievement.
Mini cities, 90 mini cities within which to train the aircrew. And in order to cut down on the accidents and increase the visibility of all those thousands of airmen that would be flying in the sky, they painted their airplanes trainer yellow, so that even the novices that were in the cockpit would have the easiest time seeing any conflict with another aircraft, and you could avoid unnecessary accidents while you were training them. So not only do we have the heavy bombers of Bomber Command, we have the primary, the secondary, and the twin engine trainers that have all been restored and rebuilt here. So any yellow airplane that you see here is part of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, a huge contribution by Canada.
What they did was they went in, and if they were chosen as pilots, they went into pilot training. Pilot training was from basic and Tiger Moths. They were then selected to go on to either perhaps fighter pilot training, advanced single engine. Many of the others who were still in the pilot category would have been sent off to multi-engine training. And it wasn't just a matter of ability. The RAF was short on bomber crews. So the guys who went into multi-engine training would become part of the Bomber Command. The ones that didn't make the pilot grade would be, depending on their skills and capacity, would be sent on to become either navigators or bombardiers or air gunners. Some of them didn't make it. They were there was an attrition rate that was quite significant in basic training. Even in the advanced training was sometimes problematic. Here in the museum, there's a display of an aircraft called a Nanton, twin-engine trainer, multi-engine trainer that went out and went into the side of a mountain here on Vancouver Island during the course of the training program that these guys were on. So they didn't all make it through, but the ones that did were certainly well-trained and well-equipped to be transferred into a fighting unit.
These aircrew with wings would go to England to become part of bomber crews. In the heavy bombers, 7 men in every crew. That final training from twin engine to 4 engine was done in England. Imagine flying a heavy bomber on a practice trip in British weather in the middle of winter with icing and lots of big hills. And so 12% injured in training.
The air training plan turned into an enormous success, an unbelievable success, and it gave us the world's finest aircrew.
Sir Arthur Harris, thank goodness he was the leader, he said we must build up our bomber forces and it will become the long-distance sword of the Allies.
Here is something of the gigantic naval armada assembled to transport the Allied armies across the English Channel.
The Navy could fight skirmishes. The Army was waiting to invade, but they couldn't invade until Bomber Command had weakened the Nazi Germany with their bombing campaign.
Bomber Command essentially was fighting 4 wars. It was fighting its air war against the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe was its biggest single problem. You know, they had tremendous defenses on the ground to shoot down planes, etc., but it was really the Luftwaffe that was the biggest problem for Bomber Command.
We had the Lancaster, which was the premier bomb hauler of World War II, could carry the greatest bomb load. The Canadian squadrons, when they first arrived, they were given the Halifaxes to fly.
Bomber Command began the war with equipment that would prove unequal to the tasks which were later given to Lancasters and Halifaxes. Operations during the early stages of the war were confined primarily to keeping in check the German Navy, and attacks on port facilities and harbors, on shipyards, were carried out with very strict instructions to avoid any action which would result in civilian casualties and even damage to private property. In practical terms, this meant returning with a full bomb load if the target could not be located or attacked. It was one challenge to take off in an aircraft fully loaded with bombs, and quite another to return to land with that same load. But the debate in both public and air ministry circles around the morality of collateral damage to civilians and private property was taken very seriously. At the beginning of the war, the day-to-day operations of Bomber Command might well have resembled more that of a garden tea party, up until the Luftwaffe began the London Blitz, and would evolve within a few short years to that of the full-blown bar brawl it became over Europe.
The city is ablaze.
As the heavy 4-engine bombers took the air war deeper into the continent, the older designs were highly effective in the Baltic Sea and along the French coast, around harbors and in major sea lanes, maintaining pressure on the margins of Fortress Europe. Wellingtons, Stirlings, and Blenheims engaged in what was called gardening.
The Second War was the war at sea. The Royal Canadian Air Force became expert at gardening or laying mines. We discovered that although a Wellington was a death trap in these bombing raids, it was actually perfect for their purposes, because when the British were dropping bombs, they were losing an aircraft for every 37 bombs they dropped.
The name derived from the code words used to indicate the aerial sowing of mines in garden plots or allotments. Despite the fanciful notion of sowing seeds or mines, planting vegetables, it was a very dangerous assignment, as aircraft would have to fly low and slow so as to not damage or destroy the mines by dropping them from a much safer height.
Well, we dropped so many bombs, we closed down every port from the Bay of Biscay in southern France up to northern Norway, shut down the entire continent with these bombs.
The signal is given for the takeoff, and the journey begins.
The Third War was the war assisting Allied armies. Bomber Command made possible the invasion of Normandy with casualties that were far lower than even the most optimistic person had ever projected. They played a major role.
Everything is made ready for the armies to cross, and a tremendous airborne army will strike ahead of them.
For 60 days before D-Day and 60 days after D-Day, Bomber Command pulverized the Normandy communications and supply lines so that when they attacked on D-Day, there would be no resupply of German defenses.
After D-Day, the effect of the Lancasters, the bombing missions, the many thousands of missions that were conducted over Germany, They, I believe, saved many, many thousands of lives.
Now they will land on the far side of the Rhine. They are beyond the Rhine. With one terrific blow, they have begun the last great battle in the West.
They also made an enormous difference to the American army getting across the Rhine. They thought that was going to be an absolute bloodbath, and it wasn't, thanks to Bomber Command. And then the final war was the war that was the most important war. It was the war to destroy Germany's industrial economy. It was a war that destroyed Germany's ability to continue making war.
Lancasters carried out specially important attacks on benzol plants, supplying the lifeblood of Germany's mechanized forces.
The strategic air offensive, the concerted effort to bring the war to Fortress Europe and the German homeland, began poorly. The Butt Report of 1941 was a secret document produced by a civil servant who analyzed some 600 photographs of sites bombed, compared them to the actual claims of the returning crews, and came to a conclusion which shocked the Air Ministry. On average, only 1 in 3 bombers were actually dropping bombs within 5 miles of the target, and these figures worsened to 1 in 10 over the industrial Ruhr Valley. This ironically was a bombshell that was placed very well. Given such poor results, the continuation of resources and funding to Bomber Command in favor of the other branches of service was for a time in serious jeopardy.
Earlier in the war, we didn't have very effective bombs, we didn't have very effective planes, and we didn't have very effective navigation. Really, we weren't making much of a contribution at all. Once we really got world-class navigation equipment, the world's best bombs, etc., and we really got these Lancasters going because they were essential. We were far more effective, but the Germans were very, very effective at shooting us down.
There is a study that here's the real data. It's costing all this and sacrificing all these lives and really not achieving very much. But then technology is moving, leapfrogging. Now you've got radar, you can bomb through the clouds and things like that. Now you can be very selective. You do what you can with what you have at the time.
The damage done to Germany that was widespread, that was not necessarily perfectly targeted, I can understand where the criticism's coming from. On the other hand, the opportunity to hit back by whatever means possible, and the Bomber Command was the only means at the time before landings. I think it meant an awful lot to the people to see that they were hitting back. Technological developments in bomb aiming and bomb size and just the sheer numbers of bombers that they were put over targets. Like I said, they needed the less effective time to get to where they could be effective.
Bomber Command's inability to hit industrial targets with precision was the impetus for the Area Bombing Directive of February 1942, which marked a sea change in strategy. Henceforth, Bomber Command would carry the attack to densely packed industrial centers in an effort to destroy capacity as well as the morale of workers. Not unlike the Luftwaffe attacks on London's East End in 1940 during the Blitz. It was later codified in 1943 by the Allies' Combined Chiefs of Staff at the Casablanca Conference and known to history as the Casablanca Directive. Alongside this development came 2 others which would form the foundation of the strategic air offensive. Arthur Harris took up his post as Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command. While he was not the architect of the plan, that was Frederick Lindemann, or Lord Cherwell, a close friend of Churchill and author of the Lindemann Memorandum, which proposed the de-housing strategy. Harris would be the builder, and among the tools at his disposal was the second major development in the fortunes of Bomber Command, the brand new Avro Lancaster, which entered service in March of 1942.
The Germans tell us that Bomber Command was vital to the Allied victory. The German failure to control the air and to stop Bomber Command was fatal to their ability. Even Adolf Hitler himself said it was the failure of the German Air Force that cost us the war. He told von Ribbentrop that just several days before he committed suicide. But it pinned down 1 million soldiers. It also forced them to bring back half of their 88 millimeter guns, which were the only guns that would blow up Soviet tanks. But they were switching from blowing up Soviet tanks to shooting down our aircraft. And also it took hundreds of thousands of people, and some of them highly specialized, to try to repair damage that Bomber Command inflicted. And the fact that they never knew where Bomber Command was going, so when the main force was coming into Germany on various nights, they had to shut down everybody en route, etc. The biggest indirect effect, which I don't think the Allies ever thought of really, it made a fool out of Hermann Göring, and he was the heir apparent to the Reich. And that triggered a massive internal fight of the top Nazi leaders to discredit one another, to try to grab credit for things. And they did things that were really detrimental to the Reich in order to try and discredit one another. It was a real power struggle going on as to who would become the heir apparent.
Over the great city, hundreds of 8,000 and 4,000 pounders find their targets among fires lit by more than 650,000 incendiaries.
In the public arena, the bombing of Dresden on the night of February 13-14, 1945 by the RAF at night, and the next day by the American 8th Air Force, is the single greatest mark against the record of Bomber Command. It has been the source of fierce debate among historians in the decades following, and still today.
Joseph Goebbels, two biggest lies he told in World War II were about Dresden, and both lies are believed by far too many people today. The two lies he told were, first of all, that casualties were 200,000. When he knew that they were 20,000, he simply added a zero. The second lie he told was that Dresden was of no military value. It was a quaint medieval town that we just destroyed. And that also was a complete lie. It was a major communications center, and the Russians were most anxious to destroy the communications center. It was the meeting point of three of the most important railways in the Third Reich, and they were furiously bringing in soldiers from all over for a defense, because ultimately to protect Berlin. They were building up this defense in Dresden. It had 150 war factories in Dresden that were producing war materials. So it was actually a key military target.
In the harbor outside Malta,
in the conference at Yalta between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, the endgame upon the board of Europe was discussed and finalized.
These Anglo-American discussions paved the way for meetings with the Russian staff and lead to complete accord on combined military plans for final defeat of the common enemy.
Dresden was one of several pawns in play. History does not record a specific request by the Soviets for the destruction of Dresden, but it was well understood by the Allies as a strategic necessity given the situation on the map.
In talks extending through 8 days, they make decisions aimed at sealing the doom of Nazi Germany and German militarism.
Leipzig and Chemnitz were also on the list as possible targets in this Allied effort to assist the Soviets. The Russians were within 70 miles of the city at the end of a long supply line.
Now, the British had a war report for the cabinet which said that if we did not help the Red Army as requested, the war could go on for another 2 years. That the Red Army was in a position where it really needed the help. So this was not a decision taken lightly, and it certainly was never a decision of Sir Arthur Harris. A lot of people think that he just dreamed that up on his own as something that would be fun to do, and it wasn't like that at all.
In a terrible irony, the very accuracy and precision of the attack, concentrated on the center of Dresden, was a result of the technological and operational improvements made since the long-gone days of blunt force area bombing, creating the very firestorm which swept away much of the Saxony capital in a matter of hours and taking with it the lives of over 20,000 residents. In the days and weeks and years afterward, it became a lightning rod for criticism of Bomber Command and Arthur Harris, for the wider policy of the Allies' strategic air offensive, and was at the heart of the moral question, which was plain to see among the ashes. For British Prime Minister Churchill, it seemingly became a liability.
The post-war narrative that Bomber Command somehow was ineffective and was bombing the wrong people for the wrong reasons, it kind of started just after Dresden with a regrettable cable that Sir Winston Churchill sent to General Ismay, who was kind of his personal adjutant, about Bomber Command. Now, Portal, the Chief of Staff, immediately protested to Churchill, and Churchill revised that cable just hours later. But nobody remembers the revised cable. Everybody just remembers the initial cable. That kind of started it. Then Churchill failed to mention Bomber Command in his victory speech. I mean, he had several sentences on how wonderful the Belgian soldiers were that held off the Germans for 2.5 days or whatever it was, but Bomber Command was not even mentioned. Now, 1 out of every 4 Canadians killed in that war was killed in Bomber Command. 1 out of every 4 in the British that were killed in that war were killed in Bomber Command. 1 out of every 5 Australians killed in that war were killed in Bomber Command, and he never even mentioned Bomber Command. Now, the following day, he sent a wonderful telegram to Bomber Command, extremely complimentary and very, very accurate in the key things that they had done, but nobody knows about the telegram. Nobody ever saw that. Just remember that he didn't make the speech.
The bombing of Dresden, coming as it did in the closing stages of the war, when the outcome was not in doubt, was seen by many, in both government and the public, as needless destruction. Chief of the Air Staff, Charles Portal, who had been in lockstep with Harris regarding the area bombing directive, had parted company with that directive and with Harris in favor of a more precise targeting of oil plants, convinced at this late stage of the war that depriving the Germans of oil would seize the engines of their war machine. Harris strongly disagreed. He felt that the surgical precision needed to hit such relatively small targets would be too costly in terms of losses set against the gains. While he reluctantly shifted Bomber Command resources to these new targets, he felt they would not prove to be the decisive blows to end the war, and maintained his focus on the area bombing of German cities to the very end. History, supported by Albert Speer, the German Minister of Armaments, would prove Portal to be right. While the dust of history settles and obscures many of the shapes we once could see, some remain clear. The shape of Fortress Europe under the dominion of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis is one, and in this light, Arthur Harris does not blink. In a summary of RCAF Group 6 activities in late 1943, the author expresses the hope of reasonable men who would see in the complete devastation of Berlin and other German cities the writing on the wall. But the Nazis were not reasonable men. When considering that Germany did not surrender, even as the Russians were fighting door to door in the outskirts of Berlin, in the hallways of the Reichstag itself as Hitler committed suicide, when their Axis partner in the Pacific Theater, the Empire of Japan, did not surrender until well after not 1, but 2 atomic bombs, it is reasonable to conclude that the rules of this war were indeed very different from any other.
When you're in a street fight, are you going to be a gentleman? Or if you know that guy is going to kill you, are you going to put him down first? Do you know about a street fight?
Oh yeah, no, it's nasty.
So Sir Arthur Harris was the leader of nasty, and that's why the Allies won the war.
In the Pacific Theater, the Americans had earlier changed course with the arrival of General Curtis LeMay, who would dramatically alter the endgame in Japan. At the Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah, they had constructed highly detailed reproductions of houses in both Germany and Japan, using building materials and techniques commonly found in both countries. It was here they tested incendiaries and napalm, newly invented at Harvard. On the night of March 9, 1945, using new low-altitude tactics, 16 square miles of Tokyo were burned to the ground in the most destructive firebombing in history, killing between 80 and 100,000 people. This attack on the twin targets of war production capacity and civilian workforce was in keeping with the Allies' objective: bring the enemy quickly and finally to its knees. Part of the logic was a cold calculation. The Americans believed an invasion of the Japanese homeland could cost many hundreds of thousands of American lives. LeMay went on to burn another 66 Japanese cities before war's end and enjoyed a post-war career which took him all the way to the top of the Air Force as Chief of Staff. Arthur Harris, on the other hand, and in stark contrast, was the only senior British commander to be denied a peerage directly after the war. Arthur Harris shared with Curtis LeMay an uncompromising commitment to his course of action once determined, both men believing that the surest way to hasten the end of the war was crushing the morale and the will of the enemy, attacking industrial and city centers, hammering an implacable enemy who refused to surrender. The enemy, however, were not governed by principles easily understood by those who stood across the burning divide. In the European theater, in the firebombing of Dresden and other German cities, Allied democracies, considering themselves grounded in humane principles such as the rule of law, honor and justice, fair play, decency, would quite naturally see in their actions an abrogation of those very principles. In this light, the desire to look away is understood.
You don't want a nice guy in all-out war. You want a guy who's going to finish the job when he gets the chance.
Arthur Harris, for his part, staring into the abyss that lay between the flagpoles of Allied democracies and their complete opposites, did not look away, did not recoil. He did not flinch as his whirlwind raged.
I think the one aspect of Bomber Command in World War II where it's really been universal agreement was the extraordinary bravery of the Bomber Boys. No matter how critical people were of Bomber Command, nobody ever challenged the extraordinary esprit de corps and devotion and commitment of the Bomber Boys. And I've talked to young people as well who find it almost incomprehensible that any young person would get involved with Bomber Command, but they were really convinced that what they were doing was incredibly important and essential to civilization as we know it.
These young men had a real variation in their personal histories. Many of them came from farms out on the prairies. They'd never been exposed to aircraft before. They just became aware of the war and realized that there was a contribution that they could make, and they would volunteer and go into service. For these young men, it wasn't real until they actually got over Berlin or wherever they were, Munich or wherever they were going, and got the first pieces of flak going off in front of them. I think they probably became terrified very quickly, but learned to live with it because it was the only way they could survive, was to get on with the job. To me, it's the idea that they did that night after night after night, knowing what it was like, and then being willing to set all that aside, some of them with great difficulty, and get back into that airplane and do the job.
They felt they were saving civilization from the worst form of government that had ever existed on planet Earth, and that they were in very, very real danger of losing. I mean, they were well aware of the incredible casualties of Bomber Command, and they were all volunteers.
The Aircrew is a group of 7 individuals, and probably the average age would have been 20 or 21 years old. So these were all kids, probably, that didn't realize how much danger was coming. I think You know, to start with, it was quite an adventure. I don't think it was that way towards the end, you know, once they'd seen some negative things for sure.
By the time they got to England and were training and then going to a squadron, fairly quickly, I would say within 2 weeks, they knew how many crews were not coming back every night. They knew they had to do 30 trips. They knew that if you multiplied the trips and the losses by 30, that they only had a very small chance of finishing 30.
And in some dangerous skies. The sky around Berlin was heavily armed with flak guns, and they had night fighters. Imagine you're flying at night. You can't have any navigation lights on. The plane is in total blackout. The only person who had interior lighting was the navigator. So you're going up amongst all these other aircraft that hopefully you can see, and that's why there were so many mid-air collisions. Aircraft icing, thunderstorms, poor visibility. And then, of course, there was the enemy. Any German night fighters attacking a Lancaster would approach from behind and underneath because there was no armament down there. They were using 20mm cannons, so they could shoot at a Lancaster long before their 303s from the tail gunner were effective. You had mechanical failures. Your radios were prone to failure. You sometimes had poor navigation, so you could get lost. And then you have to imagine you're flying at night at 20,000 feet, so it's about -40 in the aircraft.
It is incredibly cold. There are no creature comforts on board the aircraft. So you're suffering before you even get over enemy territory. I can only imagine the terror when as soon as you cross the continent, over Holland or France, everyone is out to get you. Shells exploding all around you. If you've made it this far, you get over the target, you release your payload, whatever that may be, and then your troubles are only just beginning.
The Ruhr Valley, which Bomber Command called Happy Valley, that was an incredibly dangerous place to bomb. They were armed to the teeth, they were very, very effective, and their Messerschmitts were also very effective. The really easy pickings, because the Germans kind of knew, especially when you're going back, what routes you're going to take and all of that.
You try and take a predetermined route that routes you away from the flak, but then you've got all the fighters as well that are waiting for you, not just over Germany, France, or Holland. They're waiting for you over England as well. A lot of Lancasters with all the young crew members on board coming into land, being shot down on final approach. Bear in mind as well, half your aircraft you may be flying on 2 engines. You may have crew members dead on board, severely wounded. You're coming in literally on a wing and a prayer. And you're 18, 19, 20 years old doing this, night after night after night.
Moving inside a Lancaster, it is very clear very quickly that it was designed to carry and deliver a great weight of bombs, with crew considerations a distant second to this primary need. If needing to bail out, the chances of escaping a Lancaster were extremely poor, at roughly 10 to 15%.
The bomb bay on this aircraft is 30 feet long, so it takes up the majority of the aircraft. To accommodate that, the main spar sits up above that floor, which then makes about a 2-foot obstacle. If you're wanting to go to the back of the aircraft, you have to climb over that, and then there's there's another smaller spar behind that one, but the leading one, the main spar, is about 2 feet high, and it's hard to get over it without falling on your head. If you had to bail out, so if you were up in this part of the aircraft, you'd have to go out through the nose. That's assuming that you could get there and there wasn't a fire going on that stopped you from making it through there. So the bomb aimer, he was down there, he'd be lying over that chute. He'd get up, put his chute on, lift up the hatch, throw it out the hole, and he would go out first. The rear gunner would go out through his own turret. He would turn it 90 degrees and bail out backwards. The mid-upper guy would go out through the back door. And he had to be careful not to break his back on the horizontal stabilizer, which was right there. So he'd jump out into 200-mile-an-hour wind and promptly hit that. So you had to make sure you dove dive head first out there to miss that the tailplane. So it was, and then you could throw in factors if the aircraft was on fire or was in a spin, then getting out was a monumental task.
Wow, I mean, to imagine them bundled up in parachutes and heavy jackets in minus degree weather at great altitude and be bouncing around at night. To think of them suddenly crashing to earth and being able to find their way out of their planes, it's unfathomable. It's impossible to imagine.
When the people understand the numbers of the sacrifice, 50% were killed in action, 12% were killed in training. That's how dangerous training was. And 13% of that 76% were shot down and were lucky, became POWs. But only 24 out of 100 finished their combat tour.
The young men that got into those planes day after day and flew them had immense courage, and I can't imagine what it was like for them to have to do that and to fly into a combat situation and watch planes beside you get shot down and still the next day get up and go fly again. Just must have taken a tremendous amount of guts, and I can't express how much admiration I have for the courage of those young men.
They'd seen horrific things, they'd done horrific things, and they recognized that. It's not a question that ever left them. They lived with it all their lives. They came to peace with it, or came to terms with it, if not peace. They very much regretted, almost without exception, I think, the fact that they had done such horrific damage to the civilian populations in Germany. But I think at the same time, they felt that it was something that had to be done, and they were there to do it, and that was their job, and they took it on as a job, and they did it to the best of their abilities.
The civilian casualties that it caused were absolutely enormous. If you consider that the firebombing of Hamburg killed more people than were killed in the entire 6 years of the war in the UK by German bombs. So it was a terrible business during total war. Nobody enjoyed what they were doing because they knew what was happening down below, but they still did their duty.
It was absolutely extraordinary that they just kept going. And the average age when they were killed, the average age was 23.
The experiences that these young fellows went through are indescribable and could never be understood by somebody who has not actually been through it themselves. So when they came back, they, I think, lived with those experiences, most of them. Some of them suffered more than others. I know of several suicides that took place afterwards because they simply couldn't deal with the fallout.
Within the grim statistics on Bomber Command survival rates is kept a key. The same key used to turn emotional locks on every battlefield in history. It's always going to be the other guy.
They were very quick at pulling the stuff out. You know, crews didn't come back. And that's what Father had said. You know, the stuff disappeared. He got a motorcycle. I think it was a Vincent. So large pieces, like a Vincent motorcycle that somebody, you know, in an aircrew owned, didn't come back after a mission. And, well, they don't put that in a box and ship it back to Canada. So they auctioned stuff off. I think he got it for £5, maybe £10. And that was the motorcycle that they used to get to the pub. I think that was that, you know, the churning of, you know, the people, the crews appearing, disappearing, you know, new ones coming in.
I mean, my dad's squadron, 944 airmen in his squadron were killed. To do that, they had to wipe out the entire squadron 5.5 times. So the guys that actually survived this bloodbath came back totally traumatized.
But, you know, you're very young, and I guess that's the one goal is to have very young people doing this.
I don't think my kids could have done it, but I don't think they or I could ever come close to actually getting into the skin of somebody who's gone through this. And you sit and listen to the old guys talking, and you know that they have something between them that you can never impinge on. You can never get behind and understand in its entirety.
If they knew that there was a 50-50 chance that they were not going to make the end of 30, can you imagine the character and the stamina and the bravery of these young men, that they would continue on until the end?
Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. From The Fallen by Lawrence Binyon, a poem written to commemorate the loss of a generation in the slaughterhouse of the First World War. A mere 9 words with the power to express the shape of a life cut short just above the root. Not for them the aches and pains of aging, the privilege of old age. Not for them joy and heartache in equal measure, disappointment and frustration, victory and triumph, compromise, bargaining with fate, the bewilderment and the laughter in a long life, the wonder of it all. The story of the Lancaster and her aircrew of Bomber Command is complicated by the years which closely followed. Their story was set aside in acts of political expediency, centered around Arthur Harris as head of Bomber Command and the role they played in the devastation of Germany. While he was a controversial figure, he enjoyed support at the highest level, support which was being tested even decades later.
The royal family has been extremely supportive throughout the war. Their visits to the Bomber Command stations was a tremendous morale booster. Adolf Hitler said the Queen Mother was the most dangerous woman in Europe, and he's right, she was. They were unveiling the statue of Sir Arthur Harris on the Strand. And the Queen Mother, as the patron of Bomber Command, was essentially presiding over this ceremony. And then all these protesters were there, and they were screaming bloody murder and all these things. Then they started throwing red paint on the sidewalks, and the police didn't do anything. Then they started throwing red paint onto the veterans, who were now thinking we're going to take our matters into our own hands, and at that point the police moved in and removed everybody. But the Queen Mother just presided over the whole thing, and she made it crystal clear how incredibly important Bomber Command was, how essential Bomber Command was, and that Sir Arthur Harris was one of the greatest leaders of the war. It gave me the feeling back in Canada that something is seriously wrong here, because she is so credible, and she's saying the exact reverse of what everybody else is saying.
The victorious Allies fractured, and the Cold War, which would come to dominate the next 4 decades, began in earnest. Our former enemy was now our friend, and we worked alongside to sweep away the rubble of their cities. Our former friend, our enemy, and no one wanted to talk about the elephant in the room. The dust of history settled, layer by layer, year by year. Today, 8 decades on, there are men and women who are dedicated to excavation, to discover, preserve, and maintain the legacy of those who served and died in Bomber Command.
The reason we're here is to have an example to help educate the population as to what the aircraft were like, remind them of the courage and the supreme effort that went into that war. It's a great joy to have somebody come in and say, my father flew this aircraft, or my father was a mechanic on this aircraft.
While FM 104 is being restored to her post-war livery, reflecting her career in British Columbia, for many, she still represents a connection to the Lancasters' role in the war and serves as tribute to those whose names are etched in granite in Nanton.
Go look at the memorial wall with the 10,800 airmen that gave their lives. This is why we do it, not just to fix airplanes. This is our tribute to them. And when We love to run our engines on our aircraft, and every time we run the engines and the engines come alive, the memory of those airmen comes alive.
The Bomber Command Memorial was dedicated in 2005, 60 years after the war, paid for primarily through public fundraising. That their names are etched on a memorial at all is testament to the men and women who had it built, who believed that their place in history should not be claimed entirely by soil. That their names are etched in granite in a very small prairie town south of Calgary, and not in the nation's capital or Toronto or any major city, is suggestive of collusion between successive governments and history, content to let time close the book and place it on a high shelf at the back. In the United Kingdom, the distance between Bomber Command and the government, which began in the closing stages of the war, never quite closed.
There is so much controversy about the bombing campaign.
It was not until 2012 that the Bomber Command Memorial opened in Green Park near Buckingham Palace in London.
It was built only with the support of the crews themselves, not the government. Shows how sensitive I think the issue was.
It's a beautiful, beautiful memorial, but not 1 cent of government money went into it. When they had the opening ceremony, no government official showed up, no politician showed up, but the Queen came to personally unveil the monument, and she brought 23 members of the royal family with her to that event, with the thousands of bomber boys, etc.
In Victoria, there is a striking memorial installation at Pat Bay International Airport, which commemorates those whose lives were lost there in training and in service. It's situated across the runways, opposite the main terminal. It's out of sight and out of mind, but for those locals who may pass by on the airport perimeter footpath, and spare a thought.